I played Sleeping Dogs again for the first time in over a decade, and honestly, I was shocked at how well it holds up today. The game might just be the most underrated game ever. I literally hear nobody talk about Sleeping Dogs anymore. Like, I haven't even heard a soul mention it in a very long time. But this truly is one of the greatest games I've ever played, even now, 10 years later. Now, I won't sit here and pretend, it's the greatest game of all time, but it probably is the greatest game that you've never heard of. The first RPG I ever even played was actually Sleeping Dogs. My mom was incredibly strict on the games that I could play when I was younger, but one of my friends let me steal his copy and play it once he was done with it, and I was brand new to gaming at the time. I had just received my very first gaming console, but again, I had super strict parents. So I was limited on the time that I could spend actually gaming, and I was even more limited on the games that I could play. Sleeping Dogs opened me up to a whole new genre of games that I had yet to experience. So I was really excited to hop back into it for the first time since it launched 12 years ago. The game takes place in Hong Kong, and you play as Wei Shen, an undercover cop who's trying to bring down a massive gang organization. Obviously, since you're undercover, no one knows that you're a cop, and you work your way up the gang's ladder. Along the way, you become pretty attached to a lot of the members, and the lines between what's right and what's wrong start to blur a lot. Where your true alliance lies starts to become a big question mark, and you don't know whose side you're truly on as the story progresses. This story is phenomenal. It's insanely well done, and the voice acting is so good that I have to just take a moment to talk about it.
You're asking me to release a criminal with known connections to the Triad, and not only is it against
protocol...
protocol...
For God's sake, Tang, he's one of us.
What?
Jesus, Pendrew, let me get the door. There are a few badges outside who didn't hear you.
It's all right, Wei. We can trust her.
Trust her? I just met her.
Congratulations, Tang, so now you know.
There aren't very many games that I can think of that have better voice acting than Sleeping Dogs. There are many actors in this game that you would recognize because of their talent, and it shows. I feel like just about every major character had an actor behind them who truly cared about their work here. Each character feels 10 times more real because of how good of a job the actors did. Mainly Will Yun Lee, who voices Wei. He does such a good job at conveying emotion in the game. It truly is criminally underrated here, guys. I really don't have very many words to express how underrated the game is, especially the voice acting, for real. But I'll stop glazing. There are lots of older games with amazing stories that just aren't fun to play anymore. I find myself often revisiting games that I held very dear to my soul, only to realize that they didn't actually withstand the test of time. And this was not the case with Sleeping Dogs at all. It doesn't even feel like it came out in 2012. Sure, yes, I am playing the definitive edition, which is the only edition of the game available for purchase on Steam now, but that came out in 2014. It was only 2 years later. The game looks insane for being 12 years old. There's so much to do, and the gameplay feels fresh. It really does feel ahead of its time. It feels like a more fresh or recent title, not something that came out over a decade ago. It's not the biggest world that you've ever stepped foot into. It's not the most innovative world that you've ever visited in gaming, but something about stepping into the world that is Sleeping Dogs feels so right. The game starts off on a high note, and it doesn't ever really come down. They don't do anything too flashy with the story, they don't get too extremely elaborate with it, but yet they excelled at pulling me in and just keeping me reeled in. Most of the combat in the game is hand-to-hand combat. There are weapons in the game, but you can't own any. It's less frequent that you'll use guns or weapons, but when you do, you just pick them up off of bad guys that you've already beaten with hand-to-hand combat. The combat feels a lot like the Spider-Man games or like the Arkham games. You're doing a series of combos and then hitting a power punch and knocking enemies unconscious, things like that. The game has gameplay from games I've played so many times before, yet it still feels fresh. It's so satisfying to just take on a group of 10 guys at once. Pause. Outside of the main storyline, there's also a side storyline where you help out one of the detectives that knows that you're undercover. You can help her solve a series of crimes and take down criminals while still being in your gang. Aside from that, there's a ton of little mini missions to do in the game throughout Hong Kong. They give you what's called a face level to increase. Basically, you're just doing small favors for people around the map that allows you to equip cooler looking outfits for your character and unlock some other customization options. It's basically just street cred from Cyberpunk. There's a bunch of different racing missions you can do. There's small cop missions. There's even a quest line for different girls that you can take out on dates. The game literally just feels like a smaller and a bit more dated Cyberpunk. I think Cyberpunk actually took a lot of inspiration from Sleeping Dogs because the more that I play it, the more similarities I see between the two games, because there's a ton of similarities. Basically, there's just a ton of different things that you can do outside of just playing the main story. Obviously, it's not as much as something like Cyberpunk. The map is far more linear, and there's really nothing to see outside of questing, but for its time, it was really awesome, and it still definitely holds up today. Fallout New Vegas, a game I actually just barely played for the first time ever, came out only 2 years prior, and I've played them both in the last 2 months. And that being said, I can confidently say that New Vegas feels a decade older than Sleeping Dogs does. I know that New Vegas is objectively far superior, especially in its world building and its questing, but Sleeping Dogs just feels better to play, as far as the combat goes, of course. These are the two most recent RPGs that I've played, and I'm blown away at how great Sleeping Dogs looks and plays compared to a game that came out just 2 years prior to it. Truly, the story of Sleeping Dogs is one I would recommend to anyone that enjoys single-player games. It's one of the greatest stories that I've played in gaming, and certainly the greatest amongst underrated games that people just don't really talk about. The writing is fantastic. They do a wonderful job of tackling the complexity of Way trying to do the right thing while also developing a bond with the enemy. There's a lot of unexpected twists and turns throughout the story that I just think that many of you would enjoy. It should be on everyone's list of must-play games, and I don't put too many games on that list. I've heard a lot of people throughout time compare this game to the Yakuza games. Some people in my chat said that they're very similar when I brought up Sleeping Dogs, which, by the way, I'm live every Wednesday, Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday, so make sure that you join up on my streams. But I've never played any Yakuza games, so I couldn't really say how accurate that is, but I've heard the comparison a lot. I would say think of it like Batman Arkham Knight and Cyberpunk 2077 had a baby. It's a far more linear game than Cyberpunk, but the story hits hard and it's surprisingly deep, and it has the same type of feel in combat that Batman does. It also gives you a skill tree to level up as well, so it just further deepens the options you have while doing hand-to-hand combat. It has a lot of mini games scattered throughout the map too. You can collect these little statues to learn a new combat move. You can find X amount of chests hidden around to unlock new clothing items, things like that. As far as open world games go, again, it's not the most insane open world you'll ever play in. It's a pretty linear game, and there really is next to nothing to do outside of doing missions, but that does not mean that it's bad. This game made me realize that a lot of games today try so hard to do everything that they end up not doing anything very well. Instead, they just end up with a lot of mediocre features. Sleeping Dogs is a game that doesn't need to have an insanely big open world. It doesn't need to have a crafting system. It doesn't need to have weapons for you to purchase and upgrade. Sleeping Dogs knew what it was good at, and it just stuck with it. It has an insanely good story that keeps you hooked the whole way through. It has really fun combat that does not overstay its welcome. It gives you separate missions from the story that still fit right in, and they're fun to do. Simple yet fun. Those 3 words pretty much sum up Sleeping Dogs. Now, one of the main reasons that I did dive back into the game was, again, to see if it stood the test of time, which I do think it did. But there is one area, it's not a very big deal, but it wouldn't feel right if I just didn't bring it up at all, that I don't think the game does a very good job in over time. The driving in the game can be extremely janky when you're just beginning to go to your destination. Every time I hopped in the car and I was ready to go somewhere, if I had to turn around at all, or if I hit something while I was on the road and I came to a complete stop and had to go again, it takes forever to get going because of the camera angles wigging out and the driving mechanics. I mean, the game is older, so it's really not that big of a deal, but it's something that I struggled with a ton. I kept just getting stuck when I was trying to drive around because of how shitty the mechanics were. But that is legitimately the worst thing that I could say about the game, which means it's pretty phenomenal. I think more games need to follow suit here. Stick with whatever you're good at as a studio or as a developer and run with it. You don't need to do everything in every game. It waters them down, it overwhelms the player, and more often than not, it just makes a bad game. Some games can get away with it, but not very often. Sleeping Dogs is a huge diamond in the rough that I think everyone should play. It's not crazy long, it wouldn't take months to complete and play. You could even mainline the main story in like 10 hours. But it's a game that's stupidly underrated and just not talked about enough at all, and I'm so glad that I picked it up again after all of these years. Let me know in the comments some games that you think are criminally underrated. I genuinely genuinely want to hear from you guys. I love to hear your thoughts and your opinions, and maybe I'll find some new games that I can hop into and make another video like this one about that game. And speaking of games just doing too much and kind of flopping, here's a video about how AAA studios are completely cooked. Indie devs are starting to make games on the same level of Sleeping Dogs, if not better. And big studios are gonna have a rough go trying to compete. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.